The morning mist still clung to the edges of the dock as the USS Valor sat moored at Pier 27. Though decommissioned long ago and converted into a floating museum, her silhouette still cut a proud figure against the steel-gray horizon. For most, it was a historic monument. For others, it was sacred. Thomas Grant moved slowly down the pier, one hand gripping the polished head of a cane he barely leaned on. His gait was steady despite the years. 78 years old now, his silver hair tucked neatly beneath a weathered navy cap. His eyes, sharp and bright, scanned the deck above with a familiarity that went beyond memory. This wasn't a visit, it was a return. As he reached the bottom of the gangplank, the morning crew was just finishing their first rotation. Tourists, trickled-in families with kids, amateur history buffs with cameras, local veterans nodding respectfully at the hull as they passed. Nobody noticed Thomas at first. That was how he preferred it. He stepped aboard without hesitation. The familiar creak of the deck beneath his boots greeted him like an old friend. He moved slowly toward the starboard bow, where a faint plaque listed the names of those lost in a fire that nearly sank the Valor in 1965. 47 sailors, 6 Marines. One junior officer who bled out in Thomas's arms before sunrise ever touched the sea. He knelt not because he had to, but because he needed to. His fingers brushed the engraved names, calloused skin connecting with etched steel. He didn't speak, he never did. But the silence to him was a language louder than grief. "Excuse me, sir." The voice came sharp and fast, piercing the quiet with a blade's edge. A younger man, in a crisp, modern Navy uniform, stepped into view, his boots polished to mirror finish, and a security badge clipped to his belt. "You're not supposed to be here. This area is restricted before opening hours." Thomas stood slowly, brushing the dust from his slacks. He looked the officer over, lieutenant by the bars, maybe mid-30s, new to the post by the stiffness in his tone. "Just visiting an old friend," Thomas said gently. "Without clearance," the officer barked. "This is a federally maintained ship, not a public playground. You need to leave now." Several nearby heads turned. The tourists at the entrance paused. One child tugged his father's sleeve. A sailor polishing a bulkhead a few feet away stiffened. Thomas didn't react. He simply looked back toward the plaque, then at the lieutenant. "I bled on this deck," he said, voice soft but unyielding. The officer's eyes narrowed. "I don't care if you built the damn thing. If you don't have credentials, you're trespassing." Thomas's hand rested on the railing. His grip was light, but something in the way he stood made the air shift. The deck under his feet wasn't a tourist exhibit. It was still breathing, still alive with the echoes of a ship on fire, of screams in the dark, of his brothers calling out across flames and steel. The officer's lips curled. "I don't give warnings twice." Still, Thomas didn't move. His silence wasn't defiance, it was sacred. Every year since the ship became a museum, he came early, before the crowds, before the fanfare. Always in silence, always alone. "You want me to call the MPs?" the officer challenged. "You think that cane will keep them from dragging you out?" No response. A whisper ran through the small crowd. A few older men had begun to gather near the railings. One man with a Vietnam veteran's patch crossed his arms. Another woman, in a wheelchair with a Navy nurse pin on her lapel, whispered to her daughter. Thomas's hand flexed slightly on the cane. His stance hadn't shifted, but the tension had. The officer took another step forward. "That's it. I'm calling it in." But before he could reach for his cum unit, a second voice interrupted, deep, measured, and unmistakably authoritative. "Lieutenant." Both men turned. A tall figure approached from the gangplank. Commander Devin Markham, a decorated officer and current director of the USS Valor's Preservation Initiative. His medals gleamed subtly under his jacket, but it was the weight of his presence that made the air snap into attention. "Sir," the lieutenant asked, confused but maintaining his posture. Commander Markham approached Thomas with deliberate steps. He came to attention, and saluted. "Petty Officer First Class Thomas Grant," he said, "survivor of the 1965 engine fire, Navy Cross recipient, wounded in service of his crew. This ship owes her survival to him." The crowd went dead silent. Markham turned to the younger officer, eyes steel. "He doesn't need credentials, he is the credential." The lieutenant's mouth opened, then closed again. For a man who lived by protocol, this was an earthquake. Thomas returned the salute, slow and deliberate. Commander Markham nodded. "Every year, like clockwork, you kept this ship alive, petty officer. She's always yours." The lieutenant stepped back, shame creeping into his face. A few tourists clapped quietly. The sailor polishing the bulkhead stood straighter. Thomas looked back at the plaque. The silence returned, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was reverent. "I'll only be a few more minutes," he said softly. "Take all the time you need," the commander replied. As Markham stepped away, Thomas turned his gaze upward, toward the bridge. The ghosts were still there, still waiting, and this time the whole ship remembered. The deck of the USS Valor had grown noticeably quieter since the confrontation. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the hush of reverence, the stillness that settles over places touched by something sacred. Thomas Grant remained near the memorial plaque, his hand resting gently on the railing, his back still straight despite the ache that had crept into his legs. Time had not broken him, it had only etched his memory deeper into the steel beneath his feet. Lieutenant Carter stood stiffly a few paces away, arms crossed, jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the watching crowd, most of whom now regarded him with something between confusion and disapproval. Some had begun whispering, pointing not at Thomas, but at him, the man who had tried to remove a living relic from sacred ground. He turned as Commander Markham approached him again. "Sir," Carter began quickly, voice lowered, "I wasn't aware there was nothing in the daily log, no clearance, no briefing." Markham cut him off with a glance. "You're right, you weren't briefed, because he never needed to be announced. Some things are tradition, not protocol." But Commander Lieutenant Markham's voice dropped further. "Do you know what happens to a man who's carried fire on his back, who's held dying friends and kept moving because if he didn't, no one would survive?" Carter hesitated. Markham pointed at Thomas without breaking eye contact. "That man dragged 8 crewmen out of the inferno during the 1965 fire, with both hands burned. He refused morphine because he wanted to stay alert. He patched ruptured fuel lines with his jacket. The only reason you're standing on this deck right now is because he didn't abandon it." Carter swallowed, his spine stiff, but eyes faltering. "I don't care how fresh your bars are, or how clean your boots are," Markham continued. "You don't speak to him like that. Not on this ship, not on my watch." As the commander turned away, Carter remained still, the weight of shame settling heavier than any regulation manual he'd ever memorized. Near the port bow, a group of Navy cadets, fresh-faced and wide-eyed, had gathered. Their instructor, a senior chief with years in his gaze, stood silently watching Thomas. "Do you know who that is?" one cadet asked. The senior chief nodded. "That's Petty Officer Thomas Grant. Served aboard Valor during her most tragic hour. Some say the fire that nearly sank her was too much for any man to survive. But he did." The chief smiled faintly. "He didn't just survive, he carried others with him. That's what makes him a sailor worth remembering." Back at the plaque, Thomas ran his hand slowly over the name of J. Wallace, a 19-year-old sailor who had joined just weeks before the fire. "I'm scared," Thomas whispered aloud, as if reciting something heard only by him. "You'll be fine, Wallace. We all are. Just keep breathing." He looked away for a moment, blinking hard. He remembered it all. The explosion that tore through the engine room, the darkness, the heat, the screams, and Wallace, boyishly afraid, clinging to his arm, even as the skin on both their backs blistered from the flames. Thomas had carried him as far as the corridor, but Wallace hadn't made it. His lungs had given out. Thomas still carried that weight more than medals, more than stories, and now, as he stood here decades later, the memory still pressed against his ribs like it had never left. Behind him, more visitors had arrived. The word was spreading fast. The veteran had returned. The officer had tried to remove him. The ship had remembered. Commander Markham re-emerged moments later, this time not alone. 2 other Navy officers walked beside him, one a captain, the other clearly high-ranking with a silver cluster on his shoulder and a weathered, deeply lined face that spoke of decades at sea. They approached Thomas without ceremony. The senior officer removed his cap, pressing it respectfully to his chest. "Mr. Grant," he said, voice thick. "Admiral Winston, I've waited a long time to meet you." Thomas turned, recognizing the name. He nodded. "I've read your citations, Admiral." "And I've read yours," Winston replied. More than once, Markham gestured toward the crowd, words spreading. You'll start seeing more familiar faces. Indeed, across the pier, former sailors and Marines were now arriving by the dozen, some in dress blues, some in civilian clothes, with modest service pins on their lapels. A few used canes, others walked with military precision despite age. One young man pushed his grandfather in a wheelchair, a bronze star pinned to the lapel of his sport coat. They came not to speak but to stand. The ship that had once burned under their feet now stood as the place that united them again. Thomas looked out at the growing crowd, the faces young and old, some wet with tears, others brimming with pride. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply nodded once. "Too many gone," he murmured, "but I remember each one." The Admiral turned to Carter, who now stood at parade rest, face flushed. "Lieutenant." "Yes, sir." "What did you say to Mr. Grant earlier?" Carter shifted uncomfortably. I asked him to leave. "I wasn't aware of—" "Did you yell at him?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand now why that was unacceptable?" "Yes, sir, I do." The Admiral nodded, then looked back at Thomas. "Permission to stand with you, petty officer?" Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "Always," he said. The Admiral moved to stand at Thomas's side, removing his cover once again. Commander Markham and several others followed. Soon, a silent half-circle had formed around Thomas and the plaque uniforms of all colors and ranks. No commands, no speeches, just presence. A flag snapped gently in the wind above them. The sun, higher now, reflected off the polished metal of the ship's railings. And as the crowd continued to grow, as more came not to speak, but to witness, one truth became clear to all. This wasn't just a moment of remembrance. It was a reckoning, a reminder that titles fade, badges tarnish, and protocols come and go. But honor true, earned, lived through the flames, honor remains. By midday, the USS Valor was no longer just a floating museum. It had become a living monument. Word of the confrontation had spread across social media and veteran networks like wildfire. What had begun as a quiet morning visit was now a gathering of sailors, Marines, civilians, cadets, and reporters, all drawn not by spectacle, but by something deeper, something unspoken. Thomas Grant remained still near the plaque where it all began, his hand resting lightly on the railing as though it tethered him to the past. He hadn't moved much in the last 2 hours, but the world around him had. Where once there was tension, there was now silence, not the uneasy kind, but the sacred quiet that blankets places hallowed by sacrifice. Lieutenant Carter stood nearby. Silent, the morning's certainty gone from his posture. His shoulders were squared, but not out of pride. They were heavy with the weight of realization. He'd come to the Valor believing protocol and position were his shields. But now, every word he'd said echoed back at him with shame. Markham and Admiral Winston stood beside Thomas now, joined by a growing circle of active duty and retired service members. Some wore uniforms, some wore nothing more than jeans and old ship hats. But all stood with quiet dignity, bound by a shared reverence for the man at the center and the ship beneath their feet. Finally, the Admiral spoke. "Today," he began, his voice carrying over the deck, "we've been reminded of something too often forgotten. Service does not end when the uniform comes off, and respect is not something that needs clearance to be given." His words weren't aimed at one man, but everyone listening knew they carried weight for Carter. "Lieutenant Carter," the Admiral said, turning toward him, "do you understand now the gravity of what you attempted this morning?" Carter swallowed hard, his voice steady but low. "Yes, sir, I do. I didn't recognize who he was, and worse, I didn't recognize what he represents." The Admiral nodded. "Then your next orders will reflect that lesson. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty aboard the Valor. You will report to the Naval Heritage Program in Washington. For the next 6 months, you will serve in veteran archive preservation reading, cataloging, and walking the names of those who served." There was no anger in the order, just purpose. And for the first time that day, Carter's shoulders eased. He nodded once. "Understood, sir." Thomas turned to face the young officer. The silence between them stretched for a moment, thick with history. Then, finally, Thomas spoke. "Sometimes, son, you have to walk the deck before you understand what was lost on it." Carter nodded, quietly. "Thank you, petty officer." Then came a moment no one expected. From the far end of the pier, a group of cadets marched in formation toward the ship. Their instructor, a grizzled senior chief, gave the order, and they stopped at the gangway. One by one, the cadets ascended. Not for training, not for ceremony, but to bear witness, to stand beside the past that had made their future possible. As they took their places, a hush fell again. Thomas looked across the sea of uniforms and eyes old and young, black and white, wrinkled and fresh-faced. This was no parade. This was something far greater. And then, in the soft breeze coming off the water, the flag above the Valar stirred. Thomas turned toward it and raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. His posture, straight as ever, defied his age. Slowly, every service member on deck followed his lead. A field of salutes rose around him, snap, precise, and unwavering. Even Carter, standing alone now, raised his hand in respect. Thomas lowered his arm. His voice, barely above a whisper, broke the quiet. This ship, remembers the words, landed like thunder. You could feel it ripple down the hull. A former sailor in a battered jacket stepped forward and saluted the memorial plaque. He whispered a name and stepped back. Then another stepped forward. Then another. An old Marine removed a dog tag from his neck and slid it behind the metal rail, leaving a piece of someone behind, someone he'd never forgotten. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. Commander Markham moved beside Thomas. "Would you like an escort off the ship, sir?" Thomas shook his head with a faint smile. I walked on alone. "I'll walk off the same way," but a young cadet, standing nearby, took a step forward and offered, not his arm, but simply his presence. "May I walk with you, petty officer?" Thomas glanced at him. Something in the boy's eyes reminded him of Wallace, the young sailor he couldn't save all those years ago. He nodded. Together, the two walked slowly across the deck. As they reached the gangway, Thomas turned one final time. The Valar gleamed in the light. Not just metal, not just history. She was alive again. He paused, raised his hand, and gave the ship one last salute. Then he descended at the bottom of the ramp. Reporters surged forward, camera flashes popping like fireworks. "Mr. Grant, how do you feel about what happened today? Do you want a public apology? What would you like the Navy to say to you?" Thomas stopped briefly. He looked into the nearest lens. "I don't need words. I got what I came for. The ship remembered me. That's enough." And with that, he walked away. No speech, no soundbite. Just the footsteps of a man who had survived the fire and still stood tall. Epilogued 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at Thomas Grant's modest home. Inside was a commendation from the Navy for his lifelong service and a handwritten note. "Mr. Grant, I've spent the past week reading the names you walked with. I understand now what I didn't that morning. Not just who you are, but what you carried. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your service. Lt. James Carter." Thomas read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the Navy cross that sat untouched on his mantel. Then he stepped onto his porch and sat. Down in the fading light, some men fight wars, others carry them, and a rare few like Thomas Grant teach the world to remember them.